Mike here.
And I'm really delighted to introduce Mike Hannis. Mike, who, as most of you know, lectures here in environmental philosophy and ethics, and has played a leading role in our environmental research, Humanities Research Centre, throughout its inception and its first year of activity. And I look forward. I mean, it's great actually. One of the really great things about this research centre has been the way it's brought together different parts of the university that previously had little or no contact. Because I'd really had hardly any experience, Mike, until this began, and I now look forward very much to all the meetings and events in which he takes part. He is eloquent, friendly, wise, and reassuring. That is, and pressure, and indeed pithy in his comments in meetings. And these interdisciplinary collaborations have really been wonderful. Mike, sorry, I'm just looking up the details here. His book, Freedom and Environment, Autonomy, Human Flourishing and the Political Philosophy of Sustainability, came out from Routledge in 2015. He is one of the editors of a book called Future Pasts, Landscape, Memory and Music in West Namibia, which arises from what I have only recently learnt to call the multi-species ethnography project, that Sean, of course, has also been played in which Sean has played the leading part, I think. But which increasingly, I think, is also making connections with other academic scholars in different disciplines in BSU and beyond. So this really is a great moment, I think, to celebrate all that work, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. I will attempt to live up to it, but no promises. As you have nicely set up, the talk that we're going to present this evening, it arises from the Future Pasts project and the work building on Sean's long-standing experience in northwest Namibia in the context there, and I have been attempting to bring some sort of scholarship from environmental ethics to bear on the fascinating contexts that arise there. One of which is this issue of trophy hunting, and in particular trophy hunting of the black rhinoceros. So this is I should flag up, this is from a working paper which is available online, and that's the rough content of it, which I will be working through, and if I find myself stuck, that will be my crib sheet. It's not yet actually published in a peer-reviewed form. I've had some interesting responses from journals that are allegedly interdisciplinary, that perhaps found it too much so, but it might just be that it was not very good, so we shall see. Anyway, so there is a rhinoceros. This is a rhinoceros known as Speedy, who I was fortunate enough to see on our recent fieldwork in Namibia, in northwestern Namibia, actually just over the border from the Palembang concession into the Toro Conservancy, which we didn't concern ourselves too much here with the difference between the two designations, but this is an area in which these are desert-adapted black rhino roaming free in this environment, and one can travel out with rangers from the Save the Rhino Trust, who are one of our partners in the project, based around there, and went out with them early one morning, and we were fortunate enough to see this marvellous specimen. Now, I mean, it is actually technically desert. It doesn't look like it. What this plant that you see here is Euphorbia damarana, I think, which is a something that rhinos can eat, very few other things can, because it's actually quite poisonous. And if you were to sort of zoom out, it actually doesn't look as green as it sort of does there. Now, this rhinoceros is about 35 years old. They live supposedly to about 40, although that's inevitably some sort of best guess average, I think. And you will notice that he doesn't have his horns. They've been sawn off. So they've been sawn off to discourage poaching by people that would saw them off much less carefully and kill him in the process. So, but this is not to talk about rhino poaching. Has all sorts of associated interesting things to say, but I would just say that it's a problematic framing in itself, because it's sort of it rests on an idea of any animal as property. It's somebody's property, and there's somebody else who's coming on to poach it. They're kind of stealing it, and this is not always the most helpful way of looking at it. So the background issue of poaching will pop up at various points, but that's not primarily what we'll be talking about. So supposedly there were once a population, people extrapolate, of up to sort of around 850,000 of these across, well, actually not only southern Africa, spreading out further north. But then by 1900, the estimate is that there were about 100,000, following an absolute orgy of so-called sport hunting, primarily by Europeans, but latterly by Americans and various other colonial parties, and of course then as the import of firearms burgeoned by other people as well. Now, and currently there are supposedly about 5,000 black rhinos left alive, about a third of which are in Namibia. And so there's a great deal of effort going into keep them safe from the poaching, so-called. This is difficult and expensive work, given the nature of the beast and also the terrain. Now, and then this is where we get to the curious bit, where apparently one of the ways of raising funds for the preservation of the black rhino is to sell the rights to shoot them. It seems counterintuitive, in fact I'd say rightly so, but what I'll be doing is go through some of the arguments in favour of this and criticising them, and hopefully we'll sort of see the issues that emerge. But the rationale is that these reduced populations need to be managed in order to allow them to replenish themselves over time. And allegedly, one of the things that needs to be done in this management is that you get aggressive old small rhinos that fight with the younger ones and prevent them from reproducing, and these are then framed as problem animals, and the marvellous idea has come up of matching the fact that we have these problem animals that need to be culled with the fact that we have a strong demand from people who want to pay large amounts of money to shoot big, rare animals. So this kind of economic logic kicks in to say, well, we've got supply, we've got demand, marvellous, we can put the money back into the conservation of the rest of the population, and it's all good. And strangely, the sort of what we might call the conservation establishment in Namibia is pretty much solidly behind this project, and is fighting back against international criticism of this practice. This is a fairly recent bit of material that they produced, showing these sort of rising amounts of funding, supposedly going into the Game Products Trust Fund, which is the government's fund into which these licence fees are paid. And here we have the Namibian Nature Foundation saying we have to maintain strong support for a sustainable regulated industry, including trophy hunting and the free global movement of trophies, which is like, as we'll see, there's controversy arises about people being able to take their precious horns home. Just going to go through a couple of other bits of this justificatory rhetoric before we look at the reality of what actually happens. And so, this is a gentleman called Chris Brown, who is a very big cheese in the world of Namibian conservation. And here, I've taken several quotes from a pretty recent document that produced this year on him, in which he's sort of making a pretty strong justification for this trophy hunting as a conservation strategy. And I won't read them out, but here he's making two things, two arguments that he's kind of running together. And the first one is this point, which is fair, I think, that animal rights agendas, as he calls them, are not always well aligned with conservation agendas. So you may very well want to do things in your conservation management that are not in the interests of particular individual animals, but they are in the interests of the broader ecosystem, or indeed the broader population of a particular species, in this case the rhinos. Welcome, James.
Sorry, related.
No, well done for finding it. So, now this is actually, this first piece here is, this is he's sort of alluding to a fairly long-standing and well-known issue, which is the animal rights agenda and the conservation agenda don't always align. And he's sort of running that together, though, with this second point here, which is that we have to ensure that animals have a value, and that value must be competitive with other options, so other forms of land use, and if it's not, then inevitably it'll go. So the phrase that is quite old now, but still gets wheeled out: if it pays, it stays. Yeah, it's very familiar with that phrase. But the two, and he's sort of making out that these are two aspects of the same argument, but they're not. One is an ethical argument about the incompatibility of ethical valuation of individuals and of ecosystems, and the second is an economic argument about financial value in markets. So we'll come back to that. So I've said that he's aligning ethics and economics, and I think here adding in some selective cherry picking from the science, in which he says, well, in Namibia we are trying to make keeping the wildlife on the land profitable in order that it's not displaced by more profitable activities. And because of particular conditions, some places trophy hunting is much more profitable and viable than other forms of economic utilisation of wildlife, such as non-consumptive ecotourism. So this is what people often say, well, why don't you just go and take a photograph rather than shooting the damn thing, you know? So, and he says, well, no, it might seem like that, but, you know, and it's regrettable, he says, that the people concerned with animal rights have taken over the, monopolised the debate with their loud shouting about all this, because actually we need to optimise all streams of wildlife-derived revenue to make land under wildlife as competitive as possible. And the conclusion, he says, people just don't really understand how conservation works in a place like Namibia. You know, we need to strongly support well-managed ethical hunting. In fact, it should be called conservation hunting. And this is the term that they like to use. So, now we'll move on to looking at how some of this works in practice. This is a gentleman called Corey Knowlton, who is an American, who in 2014 paid $350,000 to the Namibian government for a permit to shoot a black rhino, which was, of course, one of these supposedly problematic older bulls. And the auction for the permit was held not in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, as is normal, but in fact in Dallas, at the Dallas Safari Club, which is a club for these big game hunters, because they thought they would raise more money by doing that. And in fact they did. $350,000 was, I think, still the record price for one of these permits. So now I'm going to just go to, hopefully, a short film clip which sums up some of the reality here. And I suppose, you know, in the spirit of modern political correctness, I should give a trigger warning that there are definitely triggers involved, but it's not unduly gory. So hopefully. It's about 4 minutes long.
3 days of hunting a black rhino through the unforgiving desert brush of northern Namibia. And in here. And Corey Knowlton has no regrets.
I'm pretty emotional. You've been heavily criticized for doing what you just did. Do you still feel like what you did is going to benefit the black rhino in the future?
I felt like from day one it was going to benefit the black rhino, and I'll feel like that until the day I die.
Knowlton granted CNN exclusive access into this controversial hunt for the black rhino, one of the most endangered species in the world. He won the license to hunt the rhino in an auction last year.
There's so many people who think that what you're doing out here is barbaric, and that you don't care about this black rhino.
Nobody in this situation with this particular black rhino put more value on it than I did. I'm absolutely hell-bent on the thing this happened.
Knowlton's received death threats and scathing criticism. Some animal welfare groups call conservation hunting a horrific idea.
These are incredibly majestic creatures, and their worth alive is far more, it's far greater than they are dead.
In Namibia, the biggest threats to the black rhino are poachers and often the rhinos themselves.
I'm Corey. Nice to meet you.
Knowlton is told by Namibian government observers to target 4 specific rhinos considered a high priority threat to the bird. That's the story of this rhino spotted by cameras at a watering hole just before sunrise. Last year, it killed another rhino in a gruesome fight. The hunt begins. The African brush is dense. Knowlton will have a split second to decide whether to pull the trigger.
Catastrophic mistake with Corey. You were shooting the wrong rhino. One was not on the list of opposable rhinos to be taken and hurt.
Local trackers pick up the rhino's footsteps and walk deeper into the brush.
This was the game where it's already came from. So he said, "I'm just gonna get it.
Silence is crucial. Trackers direct Knowlton and his Namibian hunting guide with hand signals. We get closer, and in an instant, the rhino flashes before us. The rhino moves around us, but he's invisible, silent. A nearly 3,000-pound beast that can move like a ghost in the brush, until it decides to charge. We don't see him until he's 30 feet away, charging right at us, and I have to dive below Knowlton's high-powered rifle. A short while later, the rhino is dead.
As we sit here at this moment and take it all in and think about what the biggest threat to these rhinos are around the world, and it's poachers, people who will kill these animals and leave them to rot in these fields of Africa just for this horn. These horns that you see here will sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market.
Corey Knowlton knows this isn't easy to watch. but he vows to take the abuse of his critics to convince the world that conservation hunting can help save the black rhino. Ed Lavandera, CNN, in Northern Namibia.
Sorry about the volume. Didn't seem to be anything much you could do about that. So, lots of things what we talk about in there. Many things to flag up. One, I guess, would be the sort of recreation of the colonial experience. Another would be the reference to the black market. The only white market is the one for people like him to take the horns home. And interestingly, the price he paid, if you work it out per kilo, it actually works out very similar to the price on the black market, coincidentally or not. So, this was, of course, very controversial. Oh, let's get on to the next slide. Particularly, there was a big outrage. You probably might remember the Cecil the Lion case that happened soon after this. It was very similar to that. And as with that one, and as with the recent discussion about importation of trophies, in this case rhino horn, there was a big controversy in the States about whether or not the Fish and Wildlife Service should allow him to import the rhino horn into the state. And I apologise for the quality of the image, but I think you can hopefully just about make it out that this is a banner from a protest. Unfortunately, I don't know where it was, but I'm pretty sure it's genuine, and it says Africans go to jail for poaching, white men go home with a trophy. Fairly eloquently making the point, I think. So, as you sort of said in the clip, you know, he got death threats, and also animal rights people were hacking the Namibian government and the Namibian national newspaper, and it was all quite lively for some time. Although, of course, it hasn't gone away. They have subsequently auctioned other permits to shoot other black rhinos, but it's quite hard to find out exactly the details of those because they're shy of the publicity now after that. So, yeah, this is the perspective of the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They are also supportive of this idea that trophy hunting can contribute to biodiversity conservation, and more specifically the conservation of the hunted species. And they cite the IUCN, International Union for Conservation, who are, you know, highly influential network of conservation professionals, and there's a reference there, you can find chapter and verse from them saying that this is a perfectly fine thing to be happening. This is another rhino hunted in 2009 by an American, and that was the case that triggered them to change their policy to allow people to bring the horns in, which previously had been banned for 30 years. But they're now convinced that that is a legitimate conservation thing. And so this is now, and so that picture, it now comes from a brochure of a hunting outfitter who, you probably can't read, it says down there, another great milestone achieved in our ongoing quest to strive for ultimate perfection. What exactly that means, I'm not sure. Now, the kind of text, I think, of trophy hunting for conservation probably goes back to Theodore Roosevelt, who people may or may not be aware was a big hunting enthusiast. And the excellent people who protest against hunting are ignorant, just as we saw the Chris Brown saying just now. You know, in fact, the genuine sportsman is the most important factor in keeping the larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination. And he practiced what he preaches. There he is in 1910 or 11 with his own rhino that we think is also a black rhino. A little bit hard to tell, but there he is, Teddy Roosevelt, who went on an 11-month, 2,500-mile African safari after he finished being the president in 1909. On the trip, he tracked or shot over 11,000 animals. many which are still on display at the Smithsonian Institute. So it goes back at least that far. But in fact, of course, this kind of hunting has for centuries been an elite leisure pursuit for the rich and powerful, and it's routinely involved the appropriation and enclosure of lands usually previously held or managed in common, and the exclusion of local or indigenous people. This has certainly been the case in Namibia, as elsewhere, but Namibia is in fact a pretty good example of that kind of history. And so, clearly, it's still going on, only now it's presented as something else. It's presented as conservation. So, how do people react to this then? Where does it go on? Well, you tend to get this kind of, oh, the heart protests, but if you use your head, you can see that this is sensible, sort of trope comes through. Now, here we have a quote from Save the Rhino International, who I should point out are different from Save the Rhino Namibia, who are against trophy hunting. But Save the Rhino International, for reasons that I don't entirely understand myself, take a different view. And they, I think it's fair to say, are sort of reluctantly supporting it. It would be nice, they say, if this didn't have to happen. If donors gave enough money to cover the spiralling costs of protecting rhinos from poachers. Or if enough money could be raised from tourism. But it just doesn't happen. Fundraising for rhinos is hard, they say. Competing against not only elephants, tigers, polar bears and pandas, but cancer charities, children's charities, and the most recent natural disaster. So, going to have to go with whatever it takes, you know. Use the head, not the heart. Similarly, here we have somebody writing in the New York Times, fairly respected commentator, after the Corrie Knowlton case. Protecting wildlife is complicated, expensive and morally imperfect. You know, and this can be a PR disaster. But nothing else matches trophy hunting for paying the bills. Now, of course, the figures that supposedly justify this are highly contested and mostly come from the hunting industry. So that would be a whole separate paper to look at what it actually is, the money and where does it go. But that's not my focus here. But suffice to say, it's very much contested. Yeah, so you know, I'm building up to what I'm going to examine shortly, whether or not this is an example of utilitarian reasoning, as it sort of appears. But before I get to that, though, I want to explain the title of the paper, Killing Nature to Save It, which is a reference to a very influential paper by Cathy McAfee from 1990, I think, called Selling Nature to Save It, in which she laments the neoliberal version of environmental economics, in which everything is to be solved by privatising all available natural resources, but just nature. And of course this paper, McAfee's paper itself, the title Selling Nature to Save It, is a deliberate reference to the infamous quote from the Vietnam War, in which the American captain, whose name escapes me for a moment, explained that they had to destroy the village in order to save it. And it literally burned it down and many people died. But I think the idea was to save it from being a bastion of the Viet Cong, but the irony was not lost on the public at the time, and McAfee later mobilised this in support of the critique of the privatisation and financialisation of the natural world. Another key quote from that: reducing organisms and ecosystems to their allegedly fungible components, assigning monetary prices calculated with reference to actual or hypothetical markets, managing the international exchange of natural resources. So versions of this have been happening in Namibia, as elsewhere, on many levels for a long time. Ecotourism itself falls into this category, arguably, as does the export of both live zoo animals and exotic meats, and of course the massive mineral industry in Namibia, another paper again. And sometimes it's unclear exactly what is being sold and whether this analysis applies. But in this case, I think it's pretty clear. It's very literal. You're actually selling the body of a living creature, not only selling the body, but selling the right to kill. And that is assigned value in a market, and is you end up with the rhinoceros as a piece of natural capital. And here I think it's worth reflecting again the parallels between the trophy hunting and the poaching industries. In both cases, it's all about the horn, which might be a medicine or it might be a trophy. The value, as I've already said, seems to be very similar. Also, the two industries have, of course, very similar and overlapping needs for knowledge, skill sets, local expertise, and trophy hunting people get very upset if you suggest that their industry might be facilitating poaching, but the connections, I think, are murky, but definitely there, I think, fair to say. You know, and I mean, some of them quite egregious, like over the border in South Africa, there have been prosecutions for what's called pseudo-hunting, where somebody comes in as a kind of alleged hunter and goes home with a horn that they haven't necessarily even shot the animal at all. So as I say, the only way to legally export a horn is as a trophy, as your personal trophy that you've shot. And the sort of legal architecture is all designed around that. It's time we saw another rhinoceros, I think, having gone into how it's all become natural capital. This is another nice picture of a black rhinoceros, this one in Etosha, I think. So, having now described all that, I kind of want to reflect a little bit on what we can say about that from my own discipline of environmental ethics. I should initially just say that, you know, when we're kind of reflecting on such matters, there are, of course, several streams of thought about how human relations with non-human animals should be conceptualised, mirroring the possible and prominent streams of ethical thought in our culture. One would be the utilitarian approach, in which one focuses on the consequences and generally minimise net suffering. Peter Singer would be an example of somebody who constructs a very strong argument for animal rights on the basis of a utilitarian framework. Alternatively, you can have a deontological framework building on Kantian ethics. People like Paul Taylor, Tom Regan, and the whole project of what's called extensionism, in which you sort of say, oh, well, you know, we used to think that only certain small classes of human beings had any moral considerability, and now we're sort of gradually expanding that out, you know, to you know, all men over 35, and then all men, and then men and women, and then maybe, you know, and then different ethnic groups also allowed in, and then we achieve some version of universal suffrage, and then maybe we talk about pushing out beyond that to bring other creatures in, and that's basically a sort of a Kantian logic that where you sort of wanting to also treat sentient non-humans as deserving of the same kind of respect as you would give to humans. Different to the utilitarian version, but in some people's hands it comes to similar outcomes. I've put in the capabilities one, although that's not quite strictly speaking a school of ethics, but Martha Nussbaum and to some extent earlier scholars, including Mary Midgley, construct fairly strong arguments for better treatment of animals on the basis of the focus on flourishing and capabilities. And then there's the virtue ethics tradition. People like Rosalind Hursthouse and Ronald Sandler want to focus on the character of the agent, in this case the hunter, but also on effects and implications for the broader social structures and presuppositions and dispositions. We'll come back to that. So, but the question I want to examine is whether or not the kind of reasoning we've been looking at is an example of utilitarianism. And it's often described as such. And here is a nice piece of writing by an American commentator who's very much against trophy hunting, and he says that it is utilitarian, and this is what's wrong with it. You know, this is the cold utilitarian ethics of the emergency room and the battlefield. It says, you know, ends justify the means. You have to do desperate things in desperate situations. You know, but he says, no, that's not for everyday life. We need a conservation ethic that is democratic, humane, and sustainable. We know, and trophy hunting conservation dependent on inequities of wealth and power is absolutely not what we need at all. And so the problem with it, he says, is that it's utilitarian, that it is only interested in the consequences and completely ruthless about how you get there. This is a compelling argument, but I would actually say, although I agree with him about what he thinks about trophy hunting, but the kind of reasoning he's decrying here, I cannot, in fact, claim the fig leaf of representing an established ethical tradition, I don't think. This is not utilitarian reasoning, as pioneers of that, like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill, would have recognised it. And I think it's actually, you know, if you want to talk about 18th, 19th century British thinkers, it's more like the economics of Adam Smith, in which the money released into the market by the self-interested consumption of the rich is thought to trickle down and benefit others. And it is thought to benefit animals as well as the people. But let's take seriously for a moment the idea that this is a utilitarian analysis that has been done. It's somewhat incomplete. The reasoning sort of purports to weigh the loss of the rhino against the gain of the money that will then go to produce better futures for a larger number of other rhinos, and hence B is bigger than A, so the act is okay. Now, of course, one can make a very long list of things that are excluded from this calculus. People who are primarily concerned with the suffering of the individual rhino would, of course, want to say that that has been insufficiently calculated or included. There are potentially effects on the broader conservation and management regimes, how exactly you manage what habitat and under what circumstances, and how does that knock on effects on the broader valuation of rhinos. I've said there as a kind of shorthand, so that's sort of referring back to the sort of bolstering this idea that this is a piece of natural capital walking around, you know, and that there's like, you know, $300,000 of horn walking around rather than an animal, you know, and it may in fact be the case that that kind of thinking, if it's wrong for poachers, how does it become right for trophy hunters? I would also want to say that although the outcome is incredibly unpredictable in any given case, you know, is it the case that by shooting this rhino today, we've really improved the chances for some other members of the same population? Well, it might be, but it's not really the case. So, of course, these kind of calculations are necessarily imprecise. Now, this is, of course, a standard objection to utilitarianism as a way of making ethical decisions, but I think this is quite salient here. But I would also particularly want to say that there's a problem and a factor that is being missed out of this supposed calculation, which is the effect on the broader social attitudes and dispositions of the people, not only actually involved with this exercise, but also just people at large hearing about it, and being members of a society in which this is seen as legitimate. So these are things that are sort of missed out. Now, there's another strand also of this critique of whether or not, critique of the claim that this is utilitarian reasoning, and one of which is that if we think about John Stuart Mill, he was concerned to introduce consideration of the qualities of the so-called pleasures and pains, as Bentham had it, that were being calculated. So, you know, he's famously wanted to say that, well, yeah, I guess I'm going back to another 101, but like Bentham sort of says, oh, well, poetry is no better than pushpin, meaning that if people are getting their pleasures, it doesn't matter where they're getting them from, but, you know, we shouldn't be elitist about it. You know, if somebody is getting their pleasure from playing pushpin, which is like a sort of bar billiards kind of game, then that's, it's pure snobbery to say that somebody's pleasure from poetry is better than that. And that's kind of true. But then also, as John Stuart Mill points out, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's never the case that one sort of pleasure is can be preferred over another. And one doesn't have to fall into sort of unreflective cultural snobbery in order to sort of be interested in the qualities of different pleasures and different satisfactions. And so John Stuart Mill, I think, would want to ask, well, what kind of satisfaction is Corey Knowlton getting from shooting the rhino? What exactly is it that makes him feel good? And what makes him prepared to pay $350,000? And is that something that we want to encourage? And what is the effect of that on not only on his character, but of others, as I say, people that are sort of involved in it or just aware of it? And he would say that, you know, disregarding these kind of considerations mean you're not actually doing utilitarian reasoning properly at all. And once you start thinking about character and motivation, then you're sort of moving a bit more towards the sort of virtue ethics territory, where you kind of ask things like, what kind of person pays for that? Not in a kind of like, oh, you're a terrible person, but just like, well, I just want to know, what exactly is being fulfilled there. So we come back to Corey Knowlton, and unfortunately the sound wasn't great, but if you were able to hear it, you would have heard a couple of these quotes. And I'm always struck by the fact that he's at great pains to downplay any idea that he goes out killing animals because he enjoys it. Even though he's like a big hunter, and this is like a massive part of his identity. And you know, these people, they collect what they call the big five, all the different large animals that they want to go and have shot. And the rhino is like, you know, right up there. But yeah, he kind of, the more you hear him interviewed, it's quite fascinating because he will often kind of, he will also almost kind of edit out the bit where he actually shoots the rhino. There's a big connection between him being prepared to pay the money and the sort of conservation that later happens. And so he kind of presents it as like, I'm just the guy that was prepared to do what had to be done, you know, in order to make this happen, you know. And that's how he sort of arrives in this bizarre place, as you heard him on the film, you know, that nobody put more value on this animal than I did. He says that a quarter of an hour after he's shot it. So I wasn't this evil guy who's hell-bent on doing something. So basically, even he is a very, you know, self-publicising trophy hunter, but he feels the need to make clear that he also thinks there's something wrong with enjoying the act of killing. And for a lot of people, of course, who perceive it, this kind of wrongness is not something that actually can be captured in this kind of utilitarian calculus at all, because it can't really be quantified. It's just not that kind of thing. There's no way you can put it in a balance sheet, and so you can't weigh one thing against the other in that kind of way. So what is supposedly being outweighed, I think, is not an amount of pain, but the acknowledged weight of the actual obligation to act ethically at all in the first place. And what is outweighing it is not an amount of pleasure, but the weight of the assumption that economics is the fundamental yardstick by which all human activity should be judged. So my point here is that it's not a consequentialist utilitarian argument, but an ideological one. It's a defence of what I would call economism, the idea that economics is the, as I say, a fundamental yardstick, and more fundamental than these kind of ethical reflections. And I think we would think about this stuff, and it certainly leads me to think, well, you know, actually some things are not appropriately transacted on markets, and the right to kill seems a prime example of that. Even when it's not about endangered species, as it is in this case. So we're getting towards the end, but just to sort of introduce a little black humour, it can be instructive in these kind of cases to think a little bit about analogous cases. And so where else might the right to inflict harm be sold off to raise money? And what would we think about it? So let's start with animal cases. So you've got a beloved cat or dog, it's terribly sick, take it to the vet. The vet says, oh, very sorry to break it to you, but it's incurable, we're going to have to put it down. Take it in the back room, come out again, very comforting and reassuring. Of course, they've done it lots of times before, and you might even leave with the animal in a box and go and bury it in the back garden, whatever it is you do. Now, if it were the case that in the back room were somebody who had come along and paid the vet some considerable amount of money because they had always wanted to kill a cat, yeah? Would that be okay? And if not, what's the difference? I don't think that would be okay, really. Most people would not think that was okay, I don't think. There was a case a couple of years ago, Copenhagen Zoo. They had a giraffe that was somehow surplus to requirements, so there was some issue with the genetic diversity or whatever, and they killed the giraffe. There was an outcry. But imagine how much of an outcry there would have been if there'd been an auction for the right to kill the giraffe. Say you have some unfortunate medical condition, results in you needing to have your leg amputated below the knee. Apologise to anyone for whom this is close to home, but I think it's germane. So your local hospital is underfunded. Somebody has come along. I've always wanted to saw somebody's leg off. Fine. Well, let's reach that's a bit weird, but well, maybe there's a price at which it would be okay, you know? So, like, but, you know, when it's all done in such a way that under proper supervision and everything, like the trophy hunting is done under supervision, they make sure he shoots the right rhino, they make sure they saw the right leg off, and you need to even know who sawed it off, you know? You were anaesthetised after all. But if you were later told that the person who sawed it off really enjoyed it, you might feel differently about the kind of care that you'd received. We don't normally have volunteer prison warders or volunteer, you know, custodians of mental health wards. First time I gave this paper, it was in America where they have capital punishment, and I sort of continued down that road. You can imagine. It was a bit of a silence afterwards. But you get the point, I think. And the nub of it is that the motivation is important, you know, and that if we would allow these sort of things to happen, it's kind of corrosive, I think, of what we rather tritely called the social fabric, I think. And so there are reasons why we don't do that, and I think that's because you know, we keep ethics separate from economics whenever we can, and it's important because economics and ethics have very different understandings of what a human being is, different understandings of character, of what it is to flourish, of what it is to live in a context, of what it is to have a history, and of what it is to have power. The economic perspective tends to see people as rational maximisers, homo economicus, as it's sometimes put. And that is not only a judgment on the individual, it's also a judgment on society and on cultural diversity, because we're all just rational maximisers, aren't we? We're all just making our calculations of how to get our preferences satisfied. And of course, if you don't question the existing structures of context, history and power, then you risk perpetuating things that really don't need perpetuating, such as in the trophy hunting case, the spookily colonial social relations that you see in not only that clip, but there are many others much more gruesome and graphic, and there are always black people guiding the great white hunter to slay the big animal and then congratulate him on what a great hunter he is. And I don't think that it's very hard to quantify the impact of that, I think. So yeah, the logic of so-called conservation hunting parallels the logic of poaching much more closely than people like to admit, I think. It's not utilitarian logic, it's what I would call economistic logic. It's a victory of economics over ethics. In fact, making ethical decisions, character and motivation of the agent are critically important. They're not things that you can put aside. And to be more specific, the right to kill is not something appropriately traded on markets in, I think, any circumstances. Thanks very much. Nice to be able to give the long version, actually. Every time I've previously done that, I've run out of time.
Shall I share the question? Or
Please,
you're right.
please.
Great. So, good. Provocative, perhaps, or perhaps we all agree. Talk. But do we have some questions on this one there?
Thanks, Mike. I suppose I'm interested in the question about the right to kill or to be involved in the killing of an animal, about what equivalence there is in terms of killing an animal like a cow or a chicken for food, because that, you know, as reducing an animal to like an economic value, and also, well, specifically that, and also the animal's experience of death as well. What kind of equivalences are there kind of across the wider question around killing animals?
Yeah, this is in a sense the obvious question, isn't it? And I know you're a vegan. I put my cards on the table. I'm not. But I guess the place where that kind of compromise is usually reached is around the idea that if we are going to be eating animals, then we should, you know, there are many, many caveats around it that are surely necessary. I don't presume at all to give any definite, you know, I can't say whether, well actually I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same, but I think there are certainly a lot of parallels it can draw. And I would absolutely agree that the kind of meat industry and the trajectory of increasing meat consumption is completely out of control. But without wanting to get too far into the specific arguments of that, there are also quite a lot of questions about the viability of feeding billions of people with vegan farming. There haven't been very many cultures that have gone down that road, and there are an awful lot of places where pastoralism is functional and arable farming or vegetable farming is pretty difficult. I don't say that's necessarily a knockdown argument, but it's not, it's not a cut and dried thing, And
but then neither is rhino hunting, by the sounds of it, because it's argued as a kind of sustainable conservation industry. That's sort of an ethical argument. That's a kind of contextual, working with economics, working with what we've got kind of argument. In terms of like the sheer kind of ethics of the question, surely any death is equivalent. I mean, it seems that it's different because we find the hunter disgusting, but we don't find the meat eater disgusting.
Well, I don't personally find the meat eaters disgusting, no. I'm not sure I'd necessarily use the word disgusting, but the thing I find ethically problematic about the trophy hunting, as I've tried to explain, is the kind of dishonest logic around it and the presentation of it as a way of achieving conservation objectives by perpetuating the sort of colonial practices. And I also find it problematic that even though he doth protest too much, he clearly enjoys the thrill and the chase and the actual killing, and this is very much the culture. And that I find problematic, and I don't think that there's a direct parallel between that and any instance of anybody eating meat. I mean, if I thought, we get these scandals frequently about like, oh look, this is covert film from inside the abattoir and somebody's clearly enjoying killing the cows. Like, I'm not in favour of that. That's terrible, of course. And many of the same things would apply, but yeah, I think it's, I don't subscribe to the view that killing an animal is always wrong.
So a question here on the
Yeah, it's just following on from Sam. I've actually got a friend who does the same argument but agrees with the hunting of lions for conservation. But he raised the question, when I said it was about rhinos, and it follows on from Sam, about the consumption of rhino horns. So would you say that that is a parallel to farming of animals, farming of rhinos, so you can serve them and then you take the horns for consumption?
Well, I mean, as you may know, there is quite a lot of farming of rhinos, white rhinos in South Africa that goes on, and there are people who have thereby amassed large stockpiles of rhino horn, which they are continually seeking legitimisation to sell this into the market, and you get this discussion about will that somehow undercut the poaching, or will it just legitimise it and encourage it? And I personally, I'm not really in favour of farming rhinos and selling the horn, because I think there's a problem with the fact that people are wanting to consume it in the first place, and that is something that needs work, and people are working on it, but not hugely effectively so far. But there are certainly people working in China and Vietnam and places trying to address this. But yeah, you know, it's become a massive status symbol, you know.
Why would you have a problem with someone eating a rhino or not? Like I'm
Eating a rhino?
I am a meat eater.
Right.
So I don't mind eating it. I like them. But you said you had a problem with people consuming rhino.
Oh, they're consuming the horn because of the whole thing around it. Like it's there's no good reason to be consuming rhino horn. You know, there's not. Sam would probably tell us there's no good reason to be consuming meat either. But you know,
Not the good reason.
yeah, no, sure. But I think, you know, that's in a way a different discussion, although of course it's connected. But no, I think, you know, in following up my concern with people's motivation, you know, I would be concerned about the motivation of the person that wants to smuggle the rhino horn, trade in the rhino horn, poach the rhino, buy the rhino horn, eat it, snort lines of it to show off to their friends. You know, that's not to me equivalent to eating. You know, we all need to eat.
Here and then here. Terry.
I'm interested in the interspecies aspects of this. I mean, without actually killing any animals, the human species is causing the extinction of species across the globe, beyond the question of killing. And you mentioned habitat loss as being one of the reasons why there's a focus on this particular species. And so I'm wondering how your arguments help us deal with the question of who defines conservation. Why are we focusing on this species in particular and not the bird species that are disappearing and the insect species that are less that are disappearing and so on? And whether there's a position that is without management. In other words, whether our species is able to actually ask questions about who defines conservation and what is management without a concomitant responsibility for these extinctions. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I mean, I would want to pick apart the argument the sort of framing that I think we hear too often, that our species is doing this.
Yeah.
There are particular people, particular cultures, particular groups, particular sectors, particular interest groups doing particular things. That's not to say that it's not possible to make some sort of aggregate about the effect of humanity on the planet, but I don't think that is necessarily the helpful way to approach it, because it's certainly not the way that you're going to change anything. I think, you know, this is as a sort of more general point. I think, you know, we need to be more willing to be more specific about who is doing what. That was only part of it, wasn't it?
There isn't a known non-management position, is there, in this context then, if we look specifically here?
Well,
an area has been defined and a management plan is inevitably drawn up. Is it inevitable? I mean, and what are the ethics of a non-management plan? Is that possible?
Can you explain what you mean by non-management?
Well, all I'm saying is that human beings, in this situation here, with this particular history, which I don't know, have found themselves in a position of defining conservation, of something called conservation, right?
yeah.
And it's chosen to focus on this species in this case. But it's the human beings in this situation that have defined this notion of conservation here.
Well, actually,
And is there a non-conservation position? Is there a non-management position?
Well, I would-
Is there a stepping
yeah.
back of letting nature take its course?
I think in some contexts there can be. In this context, I would reiterate that it's absolutely not the case that all the human beings involved in the area have come together and decided this. This is precisely something that has been imposed. And there's a long, complicated history of that, which Sean is much better qualified than me to tell you about. But that's probably one for the pub. But I think the reason the rhino is a conservation priority in this area, for those that want to frame it that way, is simply that this is an area in which there is one of the last populations and that there is poaching. And so there's an attempt to try and... I mean, it's not... In this particular area, where this particular rhino, there isn't trophy hunting, right? In other areas in Namibia, there is. There are different management strategies in different places. And in fact, when I saw this one, some of the people I know said, well, is it really the case that the old bulls, attack the young bulls and this is a real problem? And actually, a couple of them who seemed to know what they took about said, well, actually that's not, in our experience, the case, And so then it might well be that behaviour actually arises when they're constrained in too small an area. And it all becomes very specific, but in terms of, I think, underlying the question is the kind of rewilding sort of ethos and how real that is, and I think that is another debate that has, I think it's sort of applicable in some contexts and not in others, but like it's never the case that I mean, a no management strategy is still a management strategy, There
was a question here.
It was fascinating. I couldn't see where you were going, and then because I didn't understand where you were going to go with this, and it was interesting to bring down to this ethic. So I found myself thinking about halfway through. The poachers are more ethical. And the reason I was there was because it's a different relationship, and I thought there was a crucial difference between when you were asking about animals, and I also don't eat animals, but was that this is somebody paying to do the deed, not somebody being paid to do the deed. And that's a very different thing. People who work in slaughterhouses, who I would argue is a brutalising thing, and I think it degrades our society ethically to have people doing that. But those people are being paid to do it, and they're doing it because it's a job. People who go and hang people, like in Zimbabwe they had to advertise for hangman, didn't they? People queued up for the job because they're desperate for a job. This was just recent. So in that case you'd say, well, people are doing it for work. And you could also get it into arguments about predation and the fact that you're predating, and then you could get down to saying, well, a hunter who hunts directly in the bush for their food has a more honest and ethical relationship because they're not up to doing anything.
Well, that's a very different context.
So, if you say that, and you could, on the other hand, also say on that guy's behalf that say we accepted, for instance, say we thought we should go and take out the odd bull or whatever, because we have a situation now, we have to manage it, then you would hire people to do it. The people who would be liable to do it would be people who enjoy tracking, hunting, and all the rest of it. He's somebody who, apart from anything else, enjoys aiming a gun and hitting targets, which is something a lot of people who aren't raised in it don't appreciate about hunters, is that there's some skill and enjoyment in the act of doing it, which is not to do with killing, it's to do with hunting. And I think that's true, having known some. But it seems to me then that what you're really, the core of this is that, like the fox hunting, the unspeakable in pursuit of the uneatable, what you really don't like about this, and what is unethical, is that this is a privilege. It's an example of ownership and privilege, and the perpetuation of that unequal relationship, and that it kind of sums that up in relation to other animals and to other people. And that it's arising from that makes it unethical, whereas a poacher actually, who's being paid to go and do a job because he needs to raise money to get medical care for his village or for his family, is actually behaving in a, you wouldn't consider it as unethical. Is that right?
Well, no, I think you characterise my position fairly effectively. Really, I mean, I wouldn't justify the poacher's actions, but yes, in many cases there are some pretty significant mitigating circumstances, and they often get paid very little. You know, they would be lucky if they got 1% of what the horn eventually sells for. You know, and they're the ones that stand to get caught. You know, I mean, yeah, the tales of that are astonishing. And yes, of course, the privilege aspect. I mean, you have me banged to rights. That does get up my nose, and particularly in this context in which there's such a egregious history of that, and that this perpetuates it, and that the structure of privilege. It doesn't just dictate conservation priorities. In so doing, it dictates political and governmental priorities
So you could argue
as
it
well.
perpetuates harm in terms of social relations, and ultimately perpetuates the sort of system which has brought which has brought us into this relationship with nature, which is so serious.
Well, I think, you know,
it perpetuates that.
of course, you know, and the reason there are very few rhinos in the first place is because of people shooting them. It's, you know, of course there are many other factors, but, you know.
Can I think, perhaps partly follow that by asking whether the argument you're advancing, or the attitude to this that you're advancing, is in your view a more coherent and thoroughgoing utilitarianism than the claimed utilitarianism of the people who defend trophy hunting? Or are you arguing, and we had a debate about this in class the other day, are you arguing from a position of some sort of intrinsic value?
I would not really want to go down the intrinsic value road, because I think there's all sorts of meta-ethical problems with that probably want to bracket that for now. But no, that wouldn't be my preferred approach. I mean, I sort of signalled a bit, you know, pressed to choose between the available traditions, I would be more on the sort of virtue ethics side of it. On the utilitarianism, no, I wouldn't particularly favour that as the decision-making
But it seemed to me that the arguments you were presenting could be described as utilitarian,
well,
most of them.
I think that there's certainly a section in which I say, I think, or I mean to say, that there are people who would claim to mount a more in-depth utilitarian analysis that came out very much on the opposite side.
Right.
And that only a more in-depth utilitarian analysis is probably worthy of the name, you know. But I'm not waving a flag for utilitarianism as a way of making ethical decisions at all. What I'm saying is that it's a kind of a fig leaf, you know. It's, you know, often we're making decisions in ways that actually are kind of bypassing ethics altogether, and that those sorts of decisions made on the basis of viewing human beings solely as economic rational maximisers are presented as if you were applying a utilitarian ethics to it, and which I don't think is an accurate way of characterising that sort of decision making. And you know, I think it's fair to say that a great deal of what passes for ethics in the sort of public discourse is basically utilitarian, except I think I'd say in the field of medical ethics, where Kantian stuff is very prevalent. But generally, it's, you know, most of the sort of purported ethical discourse that we hear is all about, oh well, the consequences are good, you know, so we have to go wherever we go, even if it's a bit counterintuitive, and we'll get to the good place, you know. But, you know, I think it's very easy for all sorts of other reasoning to masquerade as as utilitarianism, and so hence I sort of talk about Bentham and Mill wouldn't like what's been done in their name, you know. Bentham, of course, you know, was in favour of an ethical system that took proper account of the suffering of animals, even though he was recognised that it was available in his time. Yes, it was. Yeah, that was his utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Robert.
Yes, I'm interested how you'd respond to a problem which is, I think it's almost exclusively Australian in terms of being unique in that I mean, Europeans shipped across to Australia all sorts of species that did not belong there. And amongst them, foxes, cats. We now have 30 million feral cats in Australia that are decimating the lizard population. The foxes find it much easier to kill the native animals than the introduced rabbits, which have also exploded in number. So I mean, it is, I mean, a lot of environmentalists in Australia would see it as imperative to go out and kill foxes and kill feral cats. And the act of doing so, of course, is no less brutalising or free from the utilitarian aspects that you raise. How would you differentiate between those things?
I take it you're saying that the people going out doing it are also enjoying it. Because
I think in a lot of cases
they probably are. Yeah, no, I'm sure
because I mean, I think they've come to partly because you know the inner hunter in them, and partly because they've come to see, you know, wrongly, the cats and the foxes as demonic.
I've seen those films of people going out pissed at night shooting cane toads and having a great time. You know.
That's another, yeah.
I mean,
introduced.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think. I think there's still something amiss, you know, if you're going out killing animals for fun in any context, yeah. But it's obviously more complicated in that situation.
Well, without the control, species would disappear. They are disappearing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that there shouldn't be control of cane toads, rabbits, whatever. I mean, I honestly don't know enough about the individual cases, but I completely accept that there are some in which it makes sense to control them, you know. You know, as you say, you are dealing with the aftermath of, like, colonialism again, in fact.
Just on that colonial aspect, though, I couldn't help thinking that certain ethical questions are a luxury of affluence as well. If you're, and that's where, you know, if we are going to protect the rhino and other species, and so it has to be an international thing, an international economic responsibility. We can't expect individual countries to preserve their rhinos, to preserve their rainforest, and so on. And I get the impression a lot of the voices raised against this form of killing are actually coming from the West. They are voices within affluent countries.
I think that's true, to be fair, although very much not exclusively so. I mean, I think, you know, there are certainly people in this context who we're not in favour of people coming in.
Could you tell us a bit more about that, actually? That would be really interesting to know. About that other organisation, the other Namibian Rhino Trust that is opposed to this and their arguments.
Well, I mean, I guess they're an organisation that is very strongly based in the local community, and has always sort of tried very hard to be so, I think. I mean, it's not. Obviously, they get funding from elsewhere and so forth, but they maximise the use or the employment of local people with local knowledge and a history of relationship with the various animals in the area. I'm not sure that that's always the case with other organisations. Yeah, so I'm still trying to work out what I think about the Australian case, you know, but I'm not. One of the things I sort of tried to make clear in this case is that as I said at the beginning, the people who are promoting this as a sort of conservation strategy for, you know, it's not just trophy hunting, it's trophy hunting of endangered species. And they say that, oh, well, all these people that are against it, they're like, you know, fluffy bunny huggers, you know, and they're just, all the objection to this stuff is put in the box of, oh, you know, overly sentimental animal rights people. And I'm not particularly seeking to, you know, pass judgment on any arguments from that perspective of the welfare of the individual animal. My concern in the paper is more to show that there can be and are many other reasons to object to it, you know.
Owen had a question.
Yeah, so I think for me biodiversity is fundamentally important in all this, and the Deep Ecology platform, I think the first one of the 8 points is biodiversity is good in itself, and the second is humans do not have a right to reduce that apart from protecting their immediate sort of needs. And kind of with the Theo's point about the poachers and the people gunning this down, you know, it's critical that this is an endangered species. You know, there's people shooting deer all over the country. Some are poaching them, some are shooting them for sport, some are shooting them for food. But they're not an endangered species. From an ecological point of view, there's probably too many. So I think biodiversity really needs to be foregrounded in this, and in the Australian case, actually. But then, if the guy says 100 years may not be looked as a saviour, this sort of whole debate about megafauna and species and humans, climate change will probably do it all anyway, or change it all anyway. There's bigger systems that are going on that are going to completely transform all this stuff. And so what, in a way, who's shooting what rhino in that picture doesn't mean that much.
Well, I think you could. I mean, I take the point that you know, it may very well be that there are larger forces at play, and that the concern with charismatic megafauna comes historically to have been seen as a bit of a sideshow, you know. But I think it is revealing of all sorts of problematic attitudes and structures of power.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. I was going to say something else, forgot what it was.
I don't know quite how long we've got. There are some more questions coming out. Should we finish at 8?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes. So perhaps I've got 3 questions. I've got Sam, I've got one here, and Kate, you have another one?
Yeah.
Can we hear all 3, and then perhaps you could answer them?
Give it a go.
So first of all, Sam?
Yeah, I was just thinking about whether the land ethic, Leopold's land ethic, kind of came into this at all. So I was thinking about the way that within the context, if we take their word for it that this is a meaningful way to conserve these animals, then according to the land ethic, it might be totally fine to kill them. Although there's also that bigger question of whether it's good to perpetuate colonial relationships with the land and just have these gun-happy Americans out there in the world being able to do whatever they want. So yeah, the land ethic and kind of the framing of this killing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I had an interest actually in just the strength of the argument, the moral argument against inappropriate motivation for killing things. Because from a pragmatic perspective, I'd be thinking, okay, you've got a few rich white men who want to do morally, one could argue, degenerate or questionable actions. But on the flip side, you get a lot of money to save the rhino, supposedly. Lots of interesting questions about whether it really does help, which you outlined interestingly. What's the real strength of the argument? It seemed to be much less problematic that you've got a few individuals who want to behave questionably. There seemed to be a much stronger argument that it could be motivationally, morally corrosive for wider society to be actively enabling that, despite the fact that most people are against it. But you've then got that trade-off. So I see there's a very strong argument to say if it's morally corrosive to society, it's very problematic. But most of the arguments that I took from what you were saying were more about the individual themselves as being corroded by it, which you might just say, well, we don't care about a few of these rich white guys corroding their own morals, really, if we get to save the rhino at the end of the day, which was the sort of link to the argument.
Okay.
Well, it's just really, it follows on from that, really, that I think it's important not to lose sight of what I took to be the core argument, which is kind of more along these lines, that it's the fact that it reinforces a kind of financialisation of nature, that it presupposes that the animal is how did you put it, walking natural capital, and that it therefore reinforces a kind of instrumental view of nature, which is intrinsic to all the other problems that we're looking at. It's partly manifested in climate change and habitat destruction and so on, and that it's that is really problematic about it, and that makes it extremely different from killing animals to eat.
But they're just natural capital. A cow
No, they're food.
No, but for the farmer, that cow is worth £1,000. If that cow gets stolen, that's the farmer's income gone. They're not just wandering around without value attached to them. It's exactly the same thing. But
Okay.
at least I can't see how.
I don't know if you can wrap all this up in a single answer.
Well, I'll have a go. I think let's deal with Leopold first. Leopold, of course, as you probably know, was a big hunter.
Yeah.
And for him, there was no contradiction at all.
Until he saw the light, though, after shooting a wolf. That's the story.
Well, yeah, I've heard that advance, but my understanding of it is that I think he maybe had a wobble with the wolf, but certainly the Leopold who wrote the Land Epic, hunting figures quite large in the book, and is in fact, it's a text that people justifying hunting actually refer to, which is kind of distressing because, and in fact curious, because lots of people who are very against hunting also want to refer to it, and so. But of course, Leopold, I don't think is actually very consistent, and there are all sorts of ways in which he's not very consistent. And I don't think that living as a plain member and citizen of the land community, as he puts it, is consistent with going out shooting other members of that community for fun. I suppose I just think he was wrong about that. But he, of course, would come with all sorts of contexts in which actually I'm shooting this one because I'm managing the herd in this way, or some sort of stuff. So yeah, that's all we can really. It's difficult with him because he's kind of held up as an icon on both sides of the argument. So, although I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't support this, actually. Having said that, I very much doubt that he would. So, is it the problem with the particular individuals or the corrosion of wider society and moral fabric? And I would very much say the latter. I don't wish Corey Norton a horrible death like a lot of the people that sort of wish that upon him, but also I'm not hugely interested in him compared to the sort of effect of this kind of practice on broader social morals, I suppose, And I actually don't think there's a million miles between this and some dystopian situation in which, that we've seen in plenty of fiction, in which, you know, a criminal is on the run and you auction the right to go and shoot them down. Do you know what I mean? We could get there fairly easily. Certain American president would probably favour that, wouldn't he? Interestingly with him, of course, both his sons are very much into trophy hunting. There's an infamous picture of one of them with an elephant's tail, although Trump recently referred to trophy hunting as a horror show, which I think probably the best thing he's ever said. He'll probably change his mind soon, so I won't worry too much about that one. But yes, it's the things, it's the sort of justifications and the logic that's underlying it that I have a problem with, and yeah, and I think that kind of goes to Kate's question as well, really, that it's the sort of framing of all sorts of aspects of the world as resources with price tags on them, which is of course not a new thing. It's been going on for a long time, but it's kind of turbocharged now, you know, and financialised in all sorts of curious ways. And things can happen very quickly now, you know. If something becomes valuable, it can very rapidly be entirely got rid of, you know, much more quickly than used to be possible. And sadly, it's very likely that in a few years there won't be any more rhinoceroses, you know. And I think it'd be great if that was the case, but I think, you know, partly due to climate change, partly due to the kind of pressures that we're talking about, there may very well end up not being any, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn anything from what happened along the way, I think.
Thank you. And that's perhaps a good moment to finish. So could we all please thank Mark? Fascinating talk, and for providing the basis of such good debate. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we've got time to have any of this stuff.
We
do. We do. Thanks. Good.